Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome all of you to my fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement, and your host for today's call. Without further ado, I want to introduce my guest today, and I'm so delighted to have Jann Freed with me. She's an author, business coach with strategic change management and life planning expertise. I first met Jann at the International Saging Conference a few years ago when it was in North Carolina, and then we reconnected again just this last October when it was in Colorado. And Jann has written a really wonderful book. I want to tell you just a little about that, and then I'm going to introduce you to her. It's called Leading with Wisdom, Sage Advice from 100 Experts. And I really encourage all of you to get a copy of it. I mean, she's going to talk to you today. It's about leadership, but it's about living life. And as I said to her on the phone, we were talking the other day in preparation for the call, and it's a kind of timeless book, but it's also so timely given what we see happening in leadership in our country. And as I was reading the book, I was just impressed and amazed with thinking about good leaders and not so good leaders and the positive sides and the dark sides of leadership. And that's a lot of what she talks about. She's going to tell us about it. So let me tell you a little about Jann, and then we'll start the conversation. Jann Freed has a Ph.D. in leadership development and change management. She's a leadership development and change management consultant with the Janus Group. She has a 30-year career in higher education where she was a professor of business management and the Mark and K. de Cook Endowed Chair in Leadership and Character Development. She currently teaches a graduate leadership course for the University of Iowa. She's the author of 5 books, with the latest focused on leadership, the one that I just mentioned, Leading with Wisdom, Sage Advice from 100 Experts, and it's based on interviews with some of the top thinkers in the field of leadership. Jann's passionate about helping individuals and organizations go from where they are to where they want to be. She's also certified as a Saging leader through Saging International, and she'll mention more about that as the call goes on. Saging work is focused on positive aging so that people are inspired to use their wisdom and life experience for their benefit and for the benefit of organizations and communities. And for Jann, demonstrating community leadership is a priority for her. So Jann, I'm so delighted to have you with us on the call. And I think that it would be great if, as you start, you can share the story of how this book developed. What got you interested in this notion about leadership and positive leadership?
Thank you, Dora. I'm honored to be asked to be part of your wonderful series because I often try to listen monthly, so thank you. It's an interesting story because it starts back in 2004. I was teaching full-time at a small college, teaching management, leadership, marketing, and Jim Collins had just come out with the book Good to Great, and he was on a book tour, and he was in Des Moines, and so I signed up to go listen to him speak, and I actually blocked off time so I could hang around, and I was the last person in line to have him autograph a book. And so as I get up to him, I'm working on a project. Leadership is my thing. I'd love to be able to talk to you. And is there a chance that we could talk, have a conversation? And, of course, he's pretty important, and I was not feeling very important. And he kind of looks at me as if that was a really strange question. And I pulled out, again, this was 2004, so at that point in time I carried a Franklin planner. So in my planner, I had this one-page article, and it came out of Training Magazine in 1999, and it's called The Learning Person, just a one-page article by Jim Collins. And I pulled out this article, his picture's on it. He can see that it's been crumpled up and carried around, and I held it up, and I said, I've been carrying this since 1999. He goes, okay, we'll talk. So he said, give me a call. He said, I'll talk to you for an hour. So I called him a couple weeks later, and out of that conversation, I was going to be on sabbatical the following year, and I needed a research project. So we started talking. He said, what are you interested in? What do you like to do? And I said, I love to interview people. Leadership is my passion, but I just don't know what the project is. And he says, I'll tell you what I think it is. He said, everybody and their brother is writing a leadership book. But he said, who's tying it together? Who's really synthesizing everything that's out there? We've got 7 habits and the 10 best principles and 5 best rules. And he said, who's tying it all together? He said, why don't you be the person to do that? Simultaneously, I was going through this training to be certified as a Saging leader, Saging International, and I was turned on by that organization or introduced to it by my mentor, his name is Dr. Elmer Burak. Now, Elmer died about 3 or 4 years ago, but Elmer said to me, Jann, baby boomers, he was a professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and he was in charge of their Ph.D. in management program. And so management leadership, it was really his area. And he said, Jann, baby boomers, they're not going to know what to do with themselves. He said, you have to really study this positive aging. So when I talked to Elmer, after I talked to Jim Collins, Elmer said, why don't you tie these two together? Why don't you look for the sages, the really wise people in leadership, interview them about what they really think is happening in the field and what they think about leadership. And so that's really, it's a long-winded story, but I think it's interesting how you just never know where you're going to get an idea. And so then I tied those two things together, and the whole book took a decade from idea to research to analyzing the research to writing to finding a publisher. It was published by ASTD, which is now ATD, Training and Development. But I think it's timeless because I really did go after some of the top thought leaders, as you said. So that's really how it came about. And so
that's a wonderful story. It just shows that both the sort of taking advantage of situations you're in, but hanging in there. I love I can picture Jack Collins sitting there or standing there and you pulling out this piece of paper that you have crumpled in there with the article. I just think that's wonderful. So who are some of the leaders that you interviewed? And let's talk a little about that so the listeners have a sense of, who some of the people are, and then we'll get into a little of what the process was that you used.
And actually, I'll describe the process because it led to the people.
Okay, do that first.
I used what they call the snowball method of interviewing. And what that means is you just start with some of the most powerful people and then ask them, who else should I interview? And because they're pretty much leaders in their field, I could then say, recommended that I contact you. And the more people I got, the easier it was to get more people, because it was almost like they wanted to be on the list. Oh, you interviewed. And I want to give credit to a friend and neighbor of mine in Des Moines, Jim Autry. Jim Autry is really a pioneer in this field, and he is a former CEO of the magazine group at Meredith Corporation. And Jim Autry wrote the book, it's known as Love and Profit. And that came out, I forget when it came out, but it's just a classic. There's a subtitle, but everybody just calls it Love and Profit. The art of something, Love and Profit. But Jim was really well known in this field, and because of his connections, I was able to interview Warren Bennis, and several of my sages have died since I interviewed them. They were really at the later stages of their career, but at that point where they could be reflective. So I interviewed Jim Collins. I interviewed Warren Bennis, William Bridges, the expert on transition work, Max Dupree, who just died, Leadership as an Art is one of his classic books. Oh gosh. Excuse me, I'm sneezing.
Bless you.
But what's interesting is, so I used the snowball method. And since I was still teaching full time, while I was doing the research, I wrote and presented several academic papers on this research. And one of the comments that I would typically hear is, that's not a very representative sample, and where are the women? Now, I will say that I would say 1/3 women, 2/3 men, but it is still representative of kind of people who are the authors, who are teaching leadership at So a lot of these people were professors. Most of them were authors. Some of them were the top executive leadership coaches, and it's still dominated by men. I would say using the snowball method, and I did seek out women, but they're still harder to find. I interviewed Meg Wheatley, Sally Helgeson. I really did go seeking women too, but they're harder to find, and I found them also harder to agree. I think what happens is there's so much in demand that I found them harder to reach, actually. But again, there are fewer of them. So I think Meg said to me, because there are fewer, they're just harder to reach, and their time is really being sought after. So that kind of explains who I interviewed. But when I talk about the themes, it's interesting because I'll talk about the themes in workshops and when I'm using my book. And I'll say to people, do you think it was even men, women? Do you think more men, more women? And almost everybody will say, based on the themes, it sounds like you interviewed more women, or this is a book for women. And it's not. It's just really interesting. I call it, years ago, they used to call it feminine leadership. And now what's being advocated is just human leadership. You know, what kind of leadership is best for most people? So anyway, that's the process and some of the people I interviewed.
Great. And I did look up in my multitasking, James Autry's book is Love and Profit, The Art of Caring Leadership.
Right.
So said you couldn't remember the subtitle of it, so I did find that. It may be good to get into some of the themes in a moment, but let's just talk a little about how leadership connects with self-awareness. Because I think that's such an important thing because I think part of what I really liked about your book is that although you interview all these sages, these incredible leaders, the way you integrate positive psychology helps in a way to think about what makes a good person, really. And in so many parts of our life, we may be in leadership roles, even though we may not be working in a leadership role. But and so I think it would be really interesting to talk a bit about in what ways leadership connects with self-awareness and how you integrate the positive psychology into your research and work.
Okay. Out of this work, I came up with the definition that a leader is anyone who's in the position to influence the lives of others. So when I talk about this, I say teachers, coaches, pastors, parents. It's not just workplace. So if you're in a position to influence the lives of others, you are a leader. And so the first chapter is an introduction. The second chapter is really leaders know who they are. And there I'm really talking about at a deeper level, peeling back the layers. And as we peel back the layers and really understand our strengths, weaknesses, what emerges is chapter 3 is leaders don't let ego win. So many of my sages talked about the power of the ego, and so I really delved into this ego development and what does the ego do. And there's a coach out there that I love. She uses the phrase, your ego is not your amigo, is not your friend, and that you really have to understand how the ego will pop up and often manifests itself in terms of greed, jealousy, envy, micromanaging, over-controlling, defensiveness, closed to feedback, just the opposite of what I would advocate a leader needs to do. Some of my other books that Dory mentioned, I've written a couple books on continuous improvement in higher education, and that's all based on feedback. You have to be open to feedback, yet the ego often says, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to listen to it, I don't want to hear any bad news. And people don't get better that way. And we're certainly not effective as leaders if we're not open to feedback. And so that's chapter 3. So I really got into the power of the ego. And one of the things that I would do is I often say, this is my Eat, Pray, Love book of leadership, because when I would learn something, I would go do it. So when I would talk to these sages, I'd say, what do you mean by that? And how do you do that? And so then I would go off on these adventures. So, for instance, there's a chapter on, and this was a real aha to me. Let me go back to the ego one. I remember I was interviewing a guy named James Hunter, and he wrote a book, a parable book, so it's a really quick read, but it's a very powerful story, and it's called The Servant. And again, I got introduced to that because I was teaching at Central College in Pella, Iowa, is where they make Pella windows. And so many of my former students get jobs in management at Pella Windows. And so one of my former students sent me an email, and he says, "Oh, Dr. Freed," he said, "you really need to read this book called The Servant. I think you'd love it. Everybody in management at Pella Corporation, everybody has to read this book called The Servant." And he said, "We bring in the author twice a year." And he says, "I'll let you know when the author's there." So he did, and I went over, I met the author. I had already read the book, and I interview you for my study. So he's also one of my sages. But I'll never forget when he said to me, he said, "Jann, just because you're a leader doesn't mean you're good." He said, "Haven't you ever worked for a bad leader?" I'm telling you, I was so involved in this research. And at the time I started this book, I had just received you mentioned it, but it's the Mark and Kay DeCook Endowed Chair in Leadership and Character Development. And so I was head first into leadership. And every time I used the word leadership, all I could think about was good. And all of a sudden he said, "That doesn't mean you're good." And it was just like this aha. Of course it doesn't. So then I really got into the dark side of leadership and bad leadership and what makes good leaders go bad. And so anyway, chapter 3 is a chapter that I've done several keynotes on and workshops. Why do good leaders go bad? Then there's another chapter in the book, and this was an aha.
Wait, before you jump on, excuse me 1 second, before you move ahead, because I want you to in a minute, but I just want to mention to listeners that part of what's so wonderful about Jann's book is at the end of each of her chapters, she has some exercises and guidelines to think about these things. So I just wanted to mention that, so that part of what's so great about the book is it's almost like she sets up a workshop where you can try some of these exercises and begin to see what the flip side of good and the negative might be, or positive strengths that might be negative strengths. And she has that at each chapter. So I just wanted to comment on that before you go ahead. But anyway,
thank you, Dorian, because I have workshop suggestions and I have personal development suggestions at the end of each chapter. And so the book can be used in a coaching role. It could be used in workshops. Yeah, so thank you for mentioning that. So one theme that emerged, and I believe this is chapter 4, and was about death and dying and grieving. And I'm like, what does this have to do with leadership? And it just kept bubbling up. And in a nutshell, people would say to me in different ways, but they'd say, we're living in very uncertain times. People are losing positions. Companies are dying. Whole industries are disappearing. And if you think about Blockbuster, if you think about how streaming now instead of DVDs, if you think about computers now come without any disc player. I'm a photographer by hobbyist, but that whole industry, Kodak, look what's happened to film, and that whole industry is very disrupted. And so if you think about this, and so there's a lot of grief and grieving going on. And so then I really dove into death and dying and grieving and all the grief going on in the workplace, and how if you don't understand your own coping mechanisms, how can you help others as a leader deal with theirs? And so I would always probe, and I'd say, how do you teach this? How do you learn these skills? And so, for instance, several things that emerged here is several people would say, you could be a hospice volunteer. So then I went through hospice training, and now I'm a hospice volunteer. I go into homes, and I give caregivers a break. So this is why I say it's my Eat, Pray, Love book of leadership. Chapter 8, I believe, is on leaders become resilient. And so then I'd say, what does that mean, and how do you learn that? And so several people said, you need to go on retreat, and you really need to do the inner work, and you need to get to know yourself. And I go, what do you mean by retreat? And they said, like a monastery. And, oh, great. So I'm at a soccer game. I still had kids in high school at the time. And so this woman, I said to this friend of mine, I said, where's Jeff? Oh, he's at retreat. And I go, where is he? So she mentioned something. And I said, I really want to go to a monastery. And this woman in front of me turned around and she said, there's a monastery 3 hours from here. And I had never heard of it. That afternoon, I'm on the phone, and so I'm calling, and this is before internet. The monks did not. It's a Benedictine monastery. It's been there since 1853, and the monks did not have internet at this time. They do now, but they didn't then. So I'm on the phone, and I call up, and so I make arrangements to come, and so when I tell my husband what I'm doing, I'm going to go 3 days to this monastery for a silent retreat. My husband said, I've got two things to say. One, it's got to be cheaper than a spa. And two, he said, I can't believe you're going to be silent. But since 2007, I've gone at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And in fact, I got to know a monk so well that he's one of my sages, and I quote him in the book. So that's why I say it led me down all these different paths that really have changed my life. And so I think it is a life-changing book. And one of the conclusions I have at the end is it's hard to be a good leader if you're not a good person. So you really have to do the personal development work if you want to be a good leader. That's probably more than you want to know. Is that TMI?
No, I think it's terrific. And you keep using the word sage, and I know you're trained as a certified saging leader. And I know a number of people on the call probably know about sages, but not everybody. So what do you mean by that? And why did you decide to use that term for the people you interviewed in the book?
Sure, yeah. And before I forget, I will say I'm just in love with that word. And in January, I started a monthly podcast series called Becoming a Sage. So if anyone is interested in that, they just have to go to my website, jannfreed.com, Jann with two N's, Freed with two E's.com. And if you sign up for my blog, the podcast comes out as a blog post. And I will say I was honored to interview Dori. And so Dori will be coming up here in a few months. And so I interviewed her about the couples retirement puzzle, and so Dori will be on one of my podcasts. But sage, I use that word really, Saging International. We define it as someone who's wise, reflective, and they really learn from their life experience. So someone who really has turned life experience into wisdom, and that only happens upon reflection and working at it, thinking about what did I learn from that experience. And usually people are older, but not always. Sometimes in workshops, somebody will ask me, do you have to be old to be wise? And I often use the example. This was a movie a few years ago that got Oscar for the best movie, but it was Slumdog Millionaire. And I often say to people, now, how was he able, it was about a quiz show in India. And I say, how was he able to answer those questions? Because he was in his 20s, I think. And the answer is he reflected on his life experience and what did he learn from that, and he was able to answer the question. So someone who's really thoughtful, caring, mentors others, kind, generous, willing to share what they've learned. So that's what I mean by sage. And really, I found that these people, out of at least 100, I interviewed probably more, but at least 100 people, I only had a handful when I got off the phone. I said to myself, I'm not sure they're really a sage. But most people, I was just amazed at how generous they were with their time, their wisdom, sharing of resources. I think I really hit a nerve with them that they did feel that what I was doing was valuable and they wanted to participate.
Which I think lends itself to thinking about one of the other chapters in your book, which is Leaders Live Their Legacy, which is chapter 9 in your book, maybe?
Yeah.
I would imagine that's probably one of the chapters that people really like and resonate with. Can you maybe talk a bit about that, what you learned?
Yeah, exactly. That was a very powerful chapter also. And that's another one where I've been asked to speak or do workshops on. And so I say what I concluded is leaders live their legacy. And so usually legacy, even since the book came out in 2013, and I would say even since the book came out, the term legacy has become almost a buzzword. It's very popular. I'm hearing it more and more. Maybe it's just my selective perception. But, so oftentimes I'll say to people, when do we leave our legacy? And often people say, when we retire, when we die, when we leave. And I go, leave what? And I'm trying to push people, even when we leave a room, we leave a meeting, when I leave this interview, I'm leaving some of my legacy right now. So it's like breadcrumbs wherever we go. And so it does matter how we treat people. And it does matter everywhere we go. We're leaving part of what somebody's going to remember about us. And so I say that if leaders are proactive and they think about that, then they're going to be really careful about what they say, how they say it, where they say it, that it matters. And that influences how they treat others. And I say how we treat people influences how they turn around and treat others. so we really are leaving a footprint and making an impact. And a legacy can be good or bad. And sometimes I use the example, when I was in graduate school, when I was getting my Ph.D., there was this professor, and he just was old school. And his way of teaching was, I want to scare everybody. I want everybody to be afraid of me. It took the average length, and again, this was a statistics course before we could use computers. We could use calculators, but we could not use computers. So we had to know all the formulas, and we had to do them all. And the average length of time on an exam was 4.5 hours. That was average. So there were people that took 7 hours, 8 hours, people that took maybe 2 or 3. But the average, he thrived on being scary. And how this ties into legacy is later, a few years later, one of his colleagues had said that I heard through the grapevine that he had passed away. And I said I was sorry about that. And she said, well, it was a real interesting funeral. Because most of us were scared of him. And she said it was a real interesting funeral. They made it very clear this is not an open mic. No one is supposed to say anything. The only people who are supposed to speak are assigned people. And she said they had to make that announcement because they were scared what people might say. So anyway, and I said, so legacy is not necessarily positive. What difference, what impact, what imprint are we leaving on others? And it's not always positive. And so we need to think about that. So anyway, but it's been a real powerful chapter, and I think, and it ties with chapter 3 on leaders don't let ego win, because if your ego's out of control and you're not aware, and we all have an ego. I always just say you have to be aware of when it's really taking over. Because if we don't control the ego, if we let the ego control us, then we're not going to have a positive impact on others. And if we're not self-aware, we may not even know it. So that's where all these themes are really pretty interrelated. But I think that's a powerful chapter.
No, I think it is also. You also have another chapter on leaders admit mistakes fearlessly. Can you speak a little about that?
Yeah. Now, that's an interesting chapter because that was not my title. That was my editor's title. But my title was something like Vulnerability is a Strength. And because that's what I had discovered, and that's really what the research says. And he says, we want this book to appeal to men, and men don't like vulnerability, so let's reword it. Leaders admit mistakes freely. The chapter is a lot about vulnerability. And again, I often say, if you've made a mistake, most people know it, so you might as well admit it. And in continuous improvement, we call it pilot testing. If something's not working, you don't stay with it. You say, this isn't working, let's change it. Let's improve it. And I think that's an attitude or mindset that leaders need to have too. And if we've made a mistake, believe me, most people probably already know it, and that's what they're talking about. And they're talking about the mistake we've made and how we're not admitting it. And so it really is being honest and forgiving others. That forgiveness is also a topic that is in the book, the idea that no one's perfect. And I think we're more likely to follow someone who's willing to admit a mistake and make amends than someone who just acts like it didn't happen and I'm always right. Because we're not, as leaders, we're not always right. And I used to say to my children, if I made a mistake or if I had to apologize to them, I said, I have a Ph.D., but it's not in parenting, okay? No one's perfect. And so they often thought I was too strict or my curfews were too short. I should have extended them. But the idea that we're not perfect and we make mistakes. And how do you build trust? You trust them. That trust is reciprocal. If you trust them, they'll trust you. And I think admitting a mistake, can add a lot to trust. That this person, gosh, they're pretty self-aware. They realized it wasn't working and they're going to change it. Or they realized they made a mistake and they're willing to apologize for that. And so anyway, like I said, the chapters are interrelated, and then there are articles at the end or suggestions on how you do that and how you work through that.
Great. I just want to encourage people to submit questions or comments. If you go to the event page, you'll see on the left-hand side there's a place where you put your name and where you're from. And any questions or comments I'll be able to integrate. And the best question or comment, as judged by me, will get a copy of Jann's book. So I just want to encourage you to go there, and I'll try to integrate it. So let's talk a little more, though, until some questions come in from other people. What about this embracing community? What's that theme and chapter about?
Yeah. Okay. And actually, that's a theme that I've continued to write on. I had an article last year in Training Magazine. I'm fortunate to write for Training Magazine once a year. And last year it was called Leaders Build Community. And the whole thing about, there are a couple good books out there that I really like. They're research-based, written by Cheryl Turkle. And Cheryl is a professor at MIT. And for decades, she's been studying the impact of technology on community or conversation or interaction. And a lot has been written about this lately. Her book, one's called, I like the title, Alone Together. And just how people can be together, but they're still alone. And her other book is called Reclaiming Conversation, that people, because of Twitter and email and the social media, people don't want to talk to each other. They don't want to have conversations. And if you don't have conversation, if you don't practice, you don't get better at it. And so I've done a lot of writing about how leaders really have to build community because people are lonely. In fact, there was a longitudinal study done a few years ago where in the last 20 years, the number of people that people trust, confide in, has gone down. That most people most people have two people maybe that in an emergency they would feel comfortable calling, that we don't even know our neighbors, that we put up privacy fences to keep, we say a good neighbor is someone who doesn't bother us. We put up fences to keep our neighbors out, that if we had to borrow a cup of sugar from our neighbor, most of us wouldn't even know somebody to do that. And in fact, another example that I often use, and again, I use these examples to show why it's so important for leaders to make the time and effort to build community because many people are lonely. And I use the example, and this came from the book Hatching Twitter. And it's about the two guys who created Twitter. And they created it because one guy was he was going through a divorce, I believe. These are younger men. He was going through a divorce and he was really lonely. And he said, Facebook isn't fast enough. I want to be able to walk into an auditorium, a stadium, a football stadium with thousands of people, and I want to know who's there. And they created Twitter because of that. And so this whole idea that if you recognize or if you assume that most people working with and for you are lonely, then your role as a leader to really make an impact is to help people get to know one another better, is to really build that community and create those conversations. And really, there's another article. This was in Harvard Business Review, and I forget what the title was, but it was about collision, that companies now are building new headquarters like Amazon and Facebook just built a new one. They're building headquarters so that people have to collide, so that they have to interact with one another. Like coffee shops are in the center of the building so that people have to run into each other and create conversation and interaction, because in the end, that leads to higher satisfaction, higher levels of productivity, but yet doesn't happen naturally necessarily. And so I think that's really important. And so that chapter builds on that.
And it seems to dovetail, as you say, they're all linked together, but creating healthy work environments. What else have you found? It sounds like community, the resilience. What other things have you found that are part of healthy work environments for people, where people are able to be their best self?
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. Like I said, I've done a lot of writing on this community and thinking about that and creating conversations. And I think it also fits into my saging work, because one of the things that I'm working on now, Dory, is creating what I call non-financial retirement workshops for organizations, so that, because what happens is if we are what we do and we don't do it anymore, then who are we? We're really lonely, because so many people spend so much time at work that it dominates our life. And if we don't do that anymore, even if we voluntarily leave, if we're not doing that anymore, then who are we? So I advocate that what we do isn't who we are. And so really trying to think about, where can you find community if you're not in a workplace? Because community is so important to you. So where can you find that? And joining groups, joining organizations. Lots of churches have small groups now, and hobbies and interests or encore careers. You know, I basically am in an encore career. So I left full-time teaching after 30 years because I was actually commuting 2 hours a day and I didn't want to do that anymore. So I teach a graduate course one night a week now. in my hometown, Des Moines, so I don't have to drive. And then I joined a consulting firm where I do workshops and speaking and coaching and writing. Where is your community? Where's your tribe? Another way to look at it is, who's your tribe and where can you find that? Like-minded people, and they don't have to always be like-minded, but people that will support you when you need them, or people you can learn from, people you can teach, you can mentor, and some of it can be volunteer work, but I think we need, it's that sense of community is really important in the workplace and outside of the workplace. Because if you think again, if most people are lonely, and some of the statistics in 50 plus, it's not positive. I'm sure, Dory, because of your work, you're familiar with that. But if you just Google 50 plus and then put in depression, and the depression rate, numbers of people suffering from depression is going up in 50 plus. Suicide in white males is going up in 50 plus. The fastest growing segment of drug and alcohol, substance abuse in 50 plus, fastest growing, not largest. The fastest growing, all of these, the divorce rate. I have a couple of friends now going through divorce after 30 years. All of those are negative trends going up.
Yeah, I mean, well-being, positive psych. Yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that those trends that are on the rise are just not very positive. And those are all things that we need to think about if your listeners are in that age group.
And I think most of the listeners are in the 50 and up or 45 and up. And as we've said many times on these interviews and calls, well-being is connection, engagement, and purpose and meaning, and community is part of that connection and engagement. I do have a comment now from Carlene from Honolulu, as she says, the longest living state in the U.S. Thank you. She says she loves the inclusiveness of experts. And I think that's true. Talk more about that. Part of what's so rich about your book is really looking to the expertise of people in the field and experts and learning from them. Can you expand on that a little?
Well, sure. And thank you for the question. I say that my mission is to continue to learn and share what I'm learning with others, whether that's in a classroom, through writing, through workshops, whatever. And so one of the things that I'm very proud of with the book is it isn't what I think. It's what I learned from all of these people. And so really reaching out to the Marshall Goldsmiths, the Richard Leiters, those are some other people I interviewed, some of the top executive coaches in the country, and really finding out. Now, again, there are other people. I didn't interview everybody, and there are other people. I should have interviewed John Maxwell. I tried to interview Daniel Goleman, the expert on emotional intelligence, and I wasn't able to make contact with him. But the idea that I really did try to look at people who were at the peak, at the top of their career, or writing really well-known authorities in the field, and learn from them. And it was just so rewarding. Like I said, only a handful did I get off the phone and say, I'm not so sure they're a safe. But for most part, people were just so generous and then willing to recommend others. Oh, I think you should interview. And most people were also very humble. I don't know if I'm a sage, and I'd say you are absolutely. You fit my criteria. You are so very humble. And a lot of people said, oh, I don't really think. Oh, yes, you do. Yes, you do. So these would be probably about 45-minute to an hour interviews, and people are very willing to share resources. It makes me sad every time I lose a person. Andre Delbecq is somebody I met through a professional organization. He just passed away this past year. And so it always makes me sad because I just feel like their wisdom. So I'm going back and rereading some of the books and articles written by some of these people because they're just classics. So I do continue to interview people. I don't know if that is part of another book, but it's definitely part of my learning.
And it sounds like each one of the people you interviewed are in the process. They've left a legacy, and then through your book, you're leaving a legacy for yourself as well as for all of them. So speak a little more about some of the other things you've learned from your research. What are other parts that you've learned when you if you step back for a minute and just think about what you've learned from some of these very wise people? What are some of the key things?
That's a very good point. One of the questions that I would always end with is, what are you thinking about now? What are you curious about now? Was a kind of a closing question. And answers would be the mystery of life, or what will organizations look like in 50 years? People were really insightful and definitely deep thinkers, And that's just a really good question because I still stay focused. I guess what I would say is those themes continue to resonate with me, and then I continue to look for ways to, like that community. And so I've done some writing on that. And hold on a second, I'll pull it out here. But in the July-August issue of Training Magazine, I had an article I titled "What They Don't Teach in Business School." And in it, I cite two of my sages that I had interviewed in the past, and then I called them up again, and they sent me articles. One is David Noer, Noer, and he wrote the book that really was transforming for me called Healing the Wounds, Overcoming the Trauma of Layoffs, and Revitalizing Downsized Organizations. I forget the date of that book. Layoffs are just everywhere. And so what this article talks about is business schools don't prepare people to be laid off or downsized out, nor do they teach leaders how to lay off people. And the other person that was one of my sages that I cite in here is Wayne Cassio, and he teaches at, I think, the University of Denver. And he's done all kinds of writing on responsible restructuring. And so I cite him in here, and I weave in those two sages. So I think one thing that I would say is these sages continue to be resources and almost like friends to me. They're experts, and so oftentimes I'll just send an email saying, what are you currently thinking or writing on this? Or Wayne Cassio, it's Cascio, he said, I'll send you a white paper that I'm working on, a chapter in a new book. And so these connections have really kept me on top of many different fields.
So rich, yeah. Yeah,
so I continue to learn and then share what I'm learning with others through either Training Magazine, my blog. I blog about leading, living, learning, and saging. So again, I blog once a week, and people can sign up on my website, and my podcasts are once a month. I release a podcast the second Friday of every month. And so that's, again, another way that I share what I'm learning.
That's wonderful. All right, I have another question from Anne from Catonsville. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Catonsville, Maryland. She says,
okay.
I'm a 73-year-old volunteer leader living in a large retirement community. I could use some advice on growing leaders for succession. Even the older adults that live here are not interested in long-term commitments. We have a built-in community because we have over 1,700 people in independent living.
Uh-huh.
So that's the question is, how do you build? What are some suggestions on advice on growing leaders for succession? What's involved in helping people step up to the plate and maybe recognize what I hear in the question is recognize the leadership in them that times people. You know, maybe it's not recognizing the leadership, or it may be the trouble of making commitments, as Anne implies.
I'll do my best here. My parents also live in a retirement community and independent living, but they're older than that. And what I would say is maybe do some way like quick surveys just to find out who's interested. I'm sure in 1,500 people, some of these communities, it's amazing the people who live there and the backgrounds that they've had in the past. And tapping into that, what we've discovered through our church is sometimes people feel like I'm on the stewardship committee this year, and I was asking someone to do an older person than myself, and I said, would you want to be involved with this? And they said, thank you for asking, because nobody's really asked me before. And I think sometimes people get overlooked, or we make assumptions. They've been there, they've done that, they're probably burnt out, we're not going to ask them. And I think anytime people get invited to do things, they always have the option to say no. But if they don't get invited, they don't have the option to say yes. So what I might recommend is just doing some, whether it's an email survey or a 5-question survey if there's a common dining room or a place where people often frequent, a coffee shop or gift shop or something or whatever, and just collecting some information. Would you be interested in doing X or Y, or leading this effort or chairing that committee, and finding out maybe a little more about a person's background or their interests, And I think you might be surprised that there are people interested, but are they being asked, or do they know how to get connected? One of the things that I've realized in the community is my local community, we're very good at cultivating young leaders. And we need young leaders. We need young leaders to step up to the plate and take over some effort. But some people, particularly people in their 50s, need to and still want to stay engaged, and they're being overlooked and going to the younger people. And I'm saying, you know what? There is people in their 50s and 60s and early 70s, more money, more wisdom, and probably a little more leisure time, or definitely flexibility. And sometimes I notice in my local community, these people are being overlooked. And to me, that is a major mistake. And so reconnecting people again, and maybe this Ann, or if I have the name right, maybe Ann could be the connector. Maybe Ann can be the one that says, we've got these needs out there. Who's interested in stepping up? We need you. And somehow being the connector and holding a meeting or workshop or even a social gathering. We're having a social gathering from 4 to 6, a happy hour for people who want to get involved in various initiatives. Those are just some gut reactions. Because sometimes, like I said, if we don't ask people, if we invite people to do things, they can always say no, but they can't say yes if we don't invite them. And so I think Ann could be the connector.
Great. And I think another thing that came to me when you were saying that and thinking about Ann's question is sometimes I guess we need to think about what commitment we're asking, and sometimes getting people involved in little ways then gets people excited to take on maybe a little more or a little more. And it's hard sometimes as we get older to think about, well, I don't know how long I'm going to be healthy or how long I'm going to be this or that or the other. So it's hard to commit too much in the future. So maybe if they're smaller kind of things, it may work better on that. So, yeah.
Exactly. Smaller with a shorter time limit. Because even myself, I'm much better at give me a project that has a start and an end. I'm much better at volunteering for that than something that can go on forever. So I think that's a good point. Yeah.
And so Cullen from Honolulu, and he says not to be confused with Carlene. We have a Carlene and Cullen from Honolulu.
Okay.
He says, I'm curious about your non-financial retirement workshop. It's a great way to marshal the time and talent of boomers for the greater good. Can you tell us what you cover in this type of workshop? Can you fill us in a bit about what and how you teach the workshop?
Sure.
How do you use your leadership?
Sure, exactly. They're interactive workshops, and I really custom design them. My overall workshop is an introduction to organizations frequently bring in financial experts to make sure that people have enough money for retirement and to help them think about how they are managing their financial resources. This is, once people have enough, and again, enough is in quotes because it depends on your lifestyle and your goals. But once people have enough money, then what research says is they're thinking about everything else, and they're worried about everything else. That most of the time, if they've got the money thing figured out, they're worried about everything. What am I going to do with my time? And who? I'm going to lose my identity. I'm going to lose my platform. Where am I going to spend my time? And so the overall workshop is just the whole idea of looking at, sometimes I know Dory's familiar with David Corbett's work on portfolio life. But, so I weave in a lot of that in terms of looking at your life as all various aspects, not just work, and helping people see options and alternatives. I weave in encore careers. I weave in information from the book, Don't Retire, Rewire. So Dorian and I have a similar library of resources to weave these concepts in terms of if you're not working, what are you going to do? And so what I try to do is just help people see options. Another workshop's called From Making a Living to Making a Life. Another one's about embracing transition, so helping get people more comfortable with the idea of change and transition. And another metaphor that I often use is that if we're swinging through the jungle from vine to vine, we're more likely to let go of one vine if we see another vine in sight, okay? But if we don't see another vine, we're clinging on to what we have. And so I often say to organizations that if you're going to offer an early retirement incentive package, people are more likely to take it if they feel prepared to leave. And so my workshops are to help people feel more prepared to leave. And so they leave optimistic, they have hope, they see other options. And then there are all kinds of examples that I use along the way. But a friend of mine, she was a lawyer for the state of Iowa. And the minute she was fully vested, she had been doing pottery on the side for years. But the minute she was fully invested, she retired. And now she's a full-time artist. She goes to art shows and sells work out of her home and sells work in art galleries. She is happy as a clam. She had another vine in reach, and she knew what it was, and she didn't look back. And so this whole idea of helping people see their time, their talents, their resources, what is that other vine so that you can leave. And it also helps organizations free up. You can hire people at probably less money, and so there are advantages to organizations in addition to advantages for the employee. And so that's how I approach that. And then I just basically custom design based on their needs.
Great. Thanks for the description of that. So that kind of integrates back into how you're integrating all of your research into your life and work now, and maybe speak a little more about that, kind of what you've learned from the research and how you're integrating that into your life. And it sounds like your workshops are maybe part of that too.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as I said, this book changed my life. And so in the process, I started thinking about what I was doing, and I realized that at a small college after 30 years, I was really doing what I was going to be doing. And is that what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, or was I willing to take a change? And so this work really did give me the courage. I saw another vine. I can teach a graduate class. I also saw another consulting firm that I could join, which was another. So I spent about 5 years transitioning out of my full-time professorship. And so I say to people, what's interesting is we tend to plan every other phase of our life, where our kids are going to go to daycare, where they're going to go to elementary school. And if you're going to get into the right high school classes, you better do well in middle school. And if you want to get into your college, you better do well in high school. We don't start planning where we want to go to college when we're a senior in high school. Most of us want our kids to start planning earlier. But yet when it comes to retirement, we tend to do what we're doing, and then, boom, we stop doing it. And I'm saying I really advocate people taking 5 years to really plan how to let go. Where are the next vines? Where are you going to get your purpose and meaning, as you had said earlier, Dory? I really think it takes 5 years. I joined a women's executive leadership group, which gave me kind of a grounding and a network. I joined that 3 or 4 years before I left my full-time teaching job. So it takes 5 years to make some connections, do some exploring, do some interviewing, meet some people so that you feel comfortable moving on. And so anyway, that's my advice, that, I think too many people do what they're doing until the end, and then they haven't really thought about it.
So it's being conscious and intentional, really, and recognizing that rather than just entering it with default. But so what are some other takeaways? I know in your last chapter you talk about that. Maybe what are some of since you've learned so much from it, and I think today people are learning a lot of things to think about leadership, about self-awareness, about resilience, about community, about compassion, but also being worried about that we all are capable of the dark side too.
Yeah.
What are some other things that would be helpful for us to take away and hold on to? Yeah.
Exactly. I
Go
think
ahead.
it would be good. Yeah, I'm just going to summarize and conclude with some of my conclusions at the end of chapter 10.
Yeah.
So I see here, it's best to live from the inside out, that fulfillment comes from knowing your talents and values and living with integrity. Another bullet point here is life is a circular process of self-renewal, growth, and discovery, rather than a linear sequence of accomplishments. Life is a story with many chapters. Each chapter has a beginning and an end and a transition to the next chapter. We don't resist change as much as we resist transition. Understanding the process of transition is critical in order to lead ourselves and to influence others. And I will say, I mentioned this earlier, but William Bridges, who has now passed away, but he really is the expert on transition. And he's got a book, The Way of Transition, Job Transition, but he was so enlightening that I interviewed him a couple times. I went back to him and said, can I ask you more about this? Because I just found his work so fascinating. Understanding transition can lead to personal growth and renewal that benefits us and everyone around us, both personally and professionally. Acknowledging our fear of dying, embracing death, and understanding the grief process enables us to be healthier people for influencing others. FaceTime is better than Facebook. Legacy thinking should be daily thinking. When we think about how we want to be remembered, we are more likely to live the legacy we want to leave. And leadership development is really about personal development. To be a good leader, you need to be a good person. And so, anyway, those are my conclusions.
Yeah. And so, what's your current passion now? You mentioned some of it in terms of these financial workshops, but other,
Yeah, I also do academic leadership workshops. So many people in leadership roles in higher education fall into it. They don't aspire to it. And so I do academic workshops for cohorts on campus. But I would say my main passion right now are these, and I'm calling it succession program, succession workshop, that these non-financial retirement workshops are really about your success and the success of the organization. So you can look at it as success. You could also look at it as who's going to succeed, who's going to succeed me, who's going to come after me. And so I would say really that's my passion right now. And I always say the most important personal lead is yourself. So self-leadership is really the way I approach leadership. So I would say those are my passions.
That's great. This has been wonderful. Before we do the final takeaway, just let people know, first of all, the book is Leading with Wisdom, Sage Advice from 100 Experts by Jann Freed. And why don't you tell people again your website so they'll know how to get in touch with you? Okay.
Great. I invite all of you. I do have my website is jannfreed.com, Jann with 2 N's, Freed with 2 E's. And on my website, you can sign up for my blog, and I blog once a week. And if you sign up for my blog and subscribe, then you would also get my podcast, which is released the second Friday of every month. And I call it Becoming a Sage. And Dory is one of my interviewees that will be coming out in a couple months, where I interview her for my podcast series. So I invite all of you to do that. My website also describes other work that I do, workshops, change management, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I've learned with your listeners today, Dory.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And I've gotten a couple of comments from people just saying a rich session, many thanks. So I think it's been well received by people. Any final last-minute kind of takeaways you want to say, Jann?
I would just say Saging International is a really positive group. People are just so wonderful. And I guess I would just say that as we gain in life experience, in saging work, we don't say how old we are. We say how many years of life experience do we have. And as we gain in life experience, learning how to age gracefully, age holistically, age in a positive way, it's not easy given our society where the emphasis is on youth. It's about looking younger, acting younger, and saging is about acting whole, being authentic, and embracing who you are. And I would say that just for professional development reasons, I think everybody should go to a positive aging conference, a Saging International conference. Our conference is every other year, so it's not every year, and I'm actually on the planning committee for the next conference, which will be in 2018. But there's also a positive aging conference. I think that's annually. I haven't gone to that. But some kind of, I think everybody, just for your own self-worth, should go to a conference on a regular basis. Maybe that's every other year, like Saging International, just to remain positive, to learn what it means to be an elder in society, to embrace who we are, to really value that. And a sage in my mind think of someone who, they're probably older than you are, but whatever your age is, you meaning the audience, but they're ageless. You can't wait to talk to them because they're interesting. And I would say that's another thing. Stay curious, stay interested. In fact, Jim Collins, in that article that I carried around from 1999, he cites John Gardner. And John Gardner was a guru in education. And John Gardner, I think it's Gardner. But anyway, the quote is, don't strive to be interesting, strive to be interested. And I use that in workshops. And I often say to people, what's the difference? So many people want to be interesting, or we say they're interesting. What's the difference? Interesting is an internal look. Interested is an external look. And so in my mind, a sage is interested in others, interested in things, interested in life. And the focus is on everyone else, not necessarily themselves. And so that quote that's one of the reasons I carried around that one-page article. So anyway, I would say to your listeners, stay curious, stay interested.
Great.
And I'll close that.
That's a wonderful takeaway. Thank you so much, Jann, for being with us today. It was a really rich conversation. Thanks again, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.